Hello, student. I'm Professor Smataja, and I'm here to discuss one of the very important aspects of Victorian time, titled Companionate Marriage. Well, this is the culture developed during Victorian age. You can also say that familiar marriage and courtships were so important while going through the novels, fiction, poems during the Victorian era. So let us see the very culture of this companionate marriage in Victorian era. Many modern ideals surrounding love and marriage today have their roots in the Victorian era. By the beginning of the 19th century, marriages for economic and social purposes were falling out of popularity. Instead, the evolution of the family unit led to a heightened societal value for marriages based on mutual affection, emotional satisfaction, and love. Called the companionate marriage, this ideal shaped the way that people met and courted in the 19th century. This term gained currency after being used in 1924 by Dr. Melvin M. Knight, a professor of history at Barnard College. This ideal of marriages based on love gave young people, especially women, a new level of agency in their choice of partners. The widespread ideal of the companionate marriage had consequences beyond heterosexual marriages as well. Sharon Marcus asserts that the newly held belief that it was better to not marry at all than to marry without love made a space for people to choose to remain unwed. Further, the evolution of marriage laws allowed a certain amount of flexibility that allowed female couples living together to use the language of marriage to describe their relationships as well. Because of the rise in popularity of the companionate marriage, young people had more independence in their choice of partners than previous generations. However, with the parents no longer being the primary facilitators of romantic relationships, the ways that couples found each other also changed. While some couples still met through their parents or other family members, people also met through mutual friends or because they were neighbors. In addition, many people met through work or social events like picnics and church related activities. Another less common way of finding a partner was through matrimonial advertisements. Published in periodicals, matrimonial advertising began mostly in working class communities but spread to the upper classes by the 1870s. In the article titled Victorian Girls Gone Wild, Matrimonial Advertising and the Transformation of Courtship, in the popular press, Jennifer Figley argues that matrimonial advertisements provided new opportunities for lonely singles to find each other and increased women's agency in courtship. While these advertisements could provide people with a way to find a compatible partner without relying on making connections through their existing social circles, they came with a certain amount of social stigma. These ads challenged traditional gender roles of masculinity and femininity. As women were upfront about their wants and needs in their searches for husbands. Women who posted advertisements were often considered immodest. However, these immodest practices were ultimately a precursor to women's positions as more equal partners in courtship by the beginning of the 20th century. No matter How they initially met. Courtships were usually short, and couples were often engaged within 9 months, oftentimes less. During the time of courtship, couples found several ways to spend time together and grow their ties to each other. In the public sphere, they would go on long walks and attend community and social events together. Still, most courtship happened in the private realm, as men would call on women at home and have tea or supper with her and her family. Despite this, parents often allowed couples a certain amount of privacy together in the home. After these meals, at times, this led to complications, but the practice was nonetheless fairly universal. Though courtships were short, engagements were commonly much longer and usually lasted several years. This was especially the case for working class couples, as they had to work to save money for the marriage. During the engagement, couples exchanged gifts. People commonly exchanged engagement rings. They also often traded pictures of each other or had their photograph taken together. Lastly, couples often exchanged locks of hair. This was a gift that involved no expense and was a sure sign of intimacy. More often than gifts, however, couples wrote each other letters, as they were sometimes separated for long periods of time during their engagements because of work and familial obligations. Letters were the main source of communication. Many relationships developed in a large part through the written word. Though many things have changed and evolved since then, the Victorians' value for love-based marriages shaped our own cultural understanding and experiences of romantic relationship today. The image of a perfectly domestic life factored greatly into what men and women in the Victorian era looked for in a spouse. Men and women looked for a true companion, though some suggest that men and women were in a less than equal partnership. There were suggestions at the time that women really wanted a man who would be her master. A woman provided her husband with emotional support, while men would give their wives a window on the wider world of education and culture while also providing them with protection. Men in this period looked for a wife with whom they could share their anxieties, their doubts, their aspirations. Figures like Judge Ben Lindsay, author of Companionate, Marriage, portrayed sexual intimacy as the cement of marriage and birth control as a necessary support. They call for greater privacy and freedom from parental control for young couples. And they demanded sexual and psychological equality for women. Companionate marriage reflected a more individualistic society and a vision of marriage as the union of two individuals bonded through sexual love rather than the traditional institution of childbearing, kin, and property relations. A crucial part of companionate marriage is discussing the dichotomy in stereotypes of women at the beginning of the 20th century. The example of the movie Our Dancing Daughter illustrates it very well. It portrays the struggle of the modern man in choosing between the respectable yet secretly evil and exploiting woman, and the modern woman who may be looked down on by society for her short skirts and provocative dancing, but after all is fundamentally good. The idea of marrying for romance rather than marrying and possibly finding romance after first developed in the late 18th century through the Enlightenment and largely replaced arranged marriages by the time the Victorian era began. Because of this, the definition and characteristics of a successful marriage also changed. Historian Stephanie Kunj states, the measure of a successful marriage was no longer how big a financial settlement was involved, how many useful in-laws were acquired, or how many children were produced, but how well a family met the emotional needs of its individual members. Marriages were no longer critical to political unions or alliances, and instead were a refuge from work, politics, and community obligations. These changes were made both because of increased wages, which made men less reliant on their parents, meaning a man did not have to wait until he got his title and land before he could marry, and the Enlightenment's championing of individual right. Women's level of independence prior to getting married was a moving target during the Victorian era and often dependent on the specific woman and her family and situation. One of the areas that was most up for debate for unmarried women was their rights to property. For the most part, though women had more control over their property and inheritance when they were single than after they married. Unmarried women could receive a trust, could act as executor of a will, and could inherit property that she could act as administrator too. Judge Ben B. Lindsay, a strong supporter of women suffrage and birth control, was also an advocate for the modern woman and the new form of marriage, one that is built on companionship, equality, and respect. He explained that the virtuous, old-fashioned, respectable woman often capitalized on her morally correct opinion and used it to woo men into taking her as their wife, thus tricking them into an emotionless, substanceless marriage out of many forms of expressing love. The most common during that time was an expression through writing. The written word emerged as one of the primeval aspects of Victorian courtship. Women kept a diary of the courtship and both partners exchanged romantic letters. Love came wrapped in the form of letters, which became the primary medium of communication, erasing the hierarchical difference between people and connecting them. Writers of the 19th century belonged to the Romantic period of literature and wrote about the modern ideal surrounding love and marriage. The Romantic and Victorian ideas of the perfect woman were rooted in the idea of a helpmate. Many of these claims about the nature and the capacities of women resemble the classic Victorian text on the distinctive character of the sexes, such as Ruskin's of Queen's Garden and Tennyson's poems. More than alliance, marriage in the Victorian era was the unification of the souls. An instance of the newlyweds, Mr. and Mrs. Headley, complements it. Opposites attract, and sizes do not matter. Mr. Headley was more than 6 feet tall, while Mrs. Headley was barely 32 inches tall. But despite their huge height difference, they married in 1891. After all, it is love and always triumphs. Men were shy and did not feel drawn toward attractive women, but flirted with those who were reserved. This was followed by a severe and patriarchal code of conduct after marriage. Unity and togetherness were quintessential of a married couple's happy, homely hours. But despite the growing demand for the marriage industry during that time, many Victorian women still chose to remain single. According to the author of one 1896 manual for every liberty accorded to modern girls by comparison with those who came before, it made it imperative that they call no undesirable attention to their presence. Loud conversation, loitering before shop windows, moving about the street, and wearing bright colors were all unpardonable, presumably because, according to their sensibility, such signs then threatened to blur the distinction between young ladies and prostitute. Behind much of the advice and rule making can be sensed a struggle to reconcile the companionate ideal, a marriage based on love, or at least on the prospects of emotional affinity, with a concern for more practical matter such as status or money. The same middle class Victorians who encouraged lovers to get to know one another sufficiently before marriage also worried that lengthy engagements would collapse under their own weight, or worse yet, result in premarital sex. Well, cousin marriage was common in 19th century Britain, as Nancy Fix Anderson and Adam Cooper have demonstrated. It had, after all, been legally and religiously permitted since the Henrician status of 1540. Victorians did not associate it with incest. Reading familiar marriage as a purely literary device in no way renders it less important. If anything, it is perhaps more significant if we regard it as a narrative strategy generated by some way in which the romantic marriage plot failed. Familiar marriage has been integral to the marriage plot of the British fiction during the 19th century. If romantic marriage did all it was supposed to do, fiction would not have needed the familiar marriage plot. Yet, that familiar marriage plot occurs in almost every novel in which romantic marriage appears. French 19th century fiction, for instance, often canvasses competing varieties of romantic love, but the choice of lovers does not necessarily occur within or even relate to marriage. Moreover, as we shall see, the familiar marriage structure responded directly to a peculiarly 19th century construction of marriage. It could not have emerged much before 1800 because the stress that generated it did not yet exist. And it could not linger far past 1900 because cultural and legal changes fundamentally altered the significance of marriage, rendering this device relatively useless. Familiar marriage can be invoked if anyone with a long-standing familiarity with the main character becomes a suitor, including the person next door, the child of the old family friend, the adoptive sister, the best friend's brother, Roger Hamley in Wives and Daughters, 1865, and Agnes in David Copperfield, 1850. For instance, would be examples of suitors who are familiar without being literally related. Disability plays a powerful role in the familiar model. In 19th century fiction, marriage to a disabled subject can provide everything that cousin marriage or fraternal cohabitation does: companionship, egalitarian bonding, and vocational roles with sex de-emphasized. Similarly, any health condition can produce this effect. It need not to be outright disability. Recovery from fever, shipwreck, a stroke, or even the gout can have the effect of immuring the partner in domestic space, thereby turning the marriage into a familiar union. Sir Michael Audley, Sir Leicester Dedlock, even Casaubon may not exactly be disabled in the modern sense, but all suffer illness that restrict their mobility and require their wives to care intimately for their incumbent bodies. The main rationale of familiar marriages did not depend upon erotic desire. It referenced rather companionship, alliance, and friendship. If that is what one is looking for in marriage, cousin marriage, to take the most common category of familiar union, has obvious excellences. Cousins are likely to offer each other egalitarian respect. A culture that could endorse cousin marriage may be, it is suggested, a culture that cares more about the quality of that daily interaction than about any sex that the couple is or isn't having. For them, the primary meaning of a cousin marriage lay in its easy companionship. The fact that it involved consummation was a secondary consideration. Claudia Nelson explains that cousin marriage offered a chance to get to know your partner well, because one didn't need chaperones, the promise of harmonious relations with in-laws, and the reassuring prospect of keeping money within the family. These reassurances might well mean more than the risky thrills of romantic love. The vocational promise of familiar marriage and the way romantic marriage fails to provide such a future is vividly clear in Jane Eyre. St. John's greatest attraction is that he can offer Jane missionary work. He courts her not with jewels and silks like Rochester, but with an entry-level job in remedial education and advanced language classes. Where Rochester wants to showcase the erotic appeal of Jane's body, St. John wants to test Jane's employability. As he explains, I have watched you ever since we first met. I have made you my study for 10 months. I have proved you in that time by sundry tests. And what have I seen and elicited? In the village school, I found you could perform well, punctually, uprightly, never uncongenial to your habits and inclinations. Observing Jane's money management and her assiduity in studying Hindustani, St. John concludes that she will be ideal as a conductress of Indian schools. St. John's proposal is in some ways rhetorically indistinguishable from a promotion. Romantic marriage may or may not offer a job, but the point is that the woman is supposedly too enraptured by passion to care. Any woman who paused in the middle of a romantic proposal to inquire what was in it for her would seem ludicrously selfish. Indeed, Rochester denies or disdains Jane's work. What, you are my paid subordinate, are you? Oh, yes, I had forgotten the salary. He explains when they first converse. Whereas St. John admired Jane's teaching in his proposal. Rochester begins his proposal by dismissively calling her a dependent who has done her duty to her employer. In this proposal, he sneering uses vocational language only to goad Jane into the romantic rhetoric the scene actually demands. The woman's vocational future is most obvious. However, when her prospective husband is disabled, the woman will nurse the sufferer or compensate for his impairments. Once Rochester becomes disabled, his wife takes up his course, and one can assume that it would also involve the remunerative labor of managing the estate, reading bills, and writing business correspondence. She also achieves easy physical familiarity with him, combining his hair and trimming his nails, for instance. The male body becomes something to care for, not a powerful erotic force. In the last proposal at Fordian, Jen will be Rochester's nurse, a new job that gives her real work in the future, along with her renewed teaching of Adela. Familiar marriage rests on two categories, disability and desexualization, which modern readers usually do not admire much, and it is incumbent upon us to remember that Victorians may well have felt differently. A disabled body in the 19th century may have been a positive marker of spirituality, sensitivity, emotional accessibility, instead of marking a lack of health, viability, mobility, as it does in contemporary Western culture. We might think here of the common iconography of the angelic, purified, dying female body, starting with Richardson Clarissa and including Dickens's Little Nell, Young's Margaret May, and Gaskell's Ruth. J.S. Mill claims in his essay, Even with True Affection, authority on the one side and subordination on the other prevent perfect confidence. Women could not be happy in their marriages as long as they were subordinate to their husbands in any way. Caroline Norton was an illustration of this argument. She found her happiness in marriage only after marrying her second husband in 1877. With him, she enjoyed the happiness of a marriage of friends and equals. It was equality that ensured the confidence of women within marriage. With this, I conclude this discussion, that is companionate marriage during the Victorian time, with a note that there were several questions, left there to discuss the status of women. Companionate marriage or familiar marriage, well, they leave a number of area where one can do research further. With this, thank you very much. We shall meet in another lecture.